Christopher, welcome. I think some people know that we're friends. And actually, one of the things I maybe wanted to start with was, so you have your story of having gone through conversion therapy, working through all this stuff in the church. I have my story of, having to deal with a lot of discrimination and different kinds of hurt within the church, then getting involved in conversations related to conversion therapy over the last few years. And one of the things that I was reflecting on recently was, there's so many different things to hold when you're involved in these spaces. And on the one hand, for me, and I don't know if this is consistent with your experience, but for me, on the one hand, I have, all of this like hurt and anger and frustration and this desire for change and a lot of grief around what I wanted my Catholic life to look like as opposed to what I was basically allowed to live as a gay person in the church. And then on the other hand, I also have all this gratitude for, I've gone through a lot of this hard stuff, but I've met amazing people. I've gotten to make really great friends. I've had some really cool experiences. I've gotten to be a part of some amazing conversations. So, I definitely hold these two things of like, like the hurt for both me and then also a lot of people that I've encountered and work with, and also people that we've lost as a result of conversion therapy and harms in the church, but then also just this very deep sense of gratitude for all of these like great connections that I've made. So I guess one thing that I want to start off with you is, is there or if there are a couple or a few that you want to name, like areas where you can name just kind of like big grief when it comes to like this part of your life or the lives of others that you've interacted with, and then also just a source of gratitude or something that gives you gratitude today.
Yeah. Gosh. So yeah, I appreciate the question. So, you and I met probably through me doing another podcast. And the irony of this
Hmm.
whole thing is, and how that all comes together with grief and gratitude and our friendship is, um, I went through 10 years of conversion therapy and I was so desperate at the end of it that I checked myself into 10 weeks of inpatient psychological treatment. Now, it wasn't conversion therapy camp. It was a treatment center that helped people heal through emotional trauma and psychological trauma, and there was addiction recovery. And because I was so convinced that my same-sex attraction was addiction and a result of trauma, I
Mm.
checked myself in there and willingly tried to make it into conversion therapy for myself at
Yeah.
28. And at my rock bottom, that's where I finally came out and began to heal from the trauma of the church. And the core moment of that was writing a grief letter. And so what you
Mm.
do, and this is done a lot in therapy, like a lot of the stuff that was conversion therapy for me was actually like real normal therapy stuff for real trauma, but the goal was always to
Mm.
change my orientation. In this case, I
Mm.
finally did the real therapy that I'd been doing for so long, but I didn't have a conversion therapist doing it with me at this treatment center. And it was a grief
Yeah.
letter to Catholicism where, I mean, I'm remembering some of it was like, Dear Catholicism, like you have given me,
Mm.
I was working at a church at the time. You have given me all of my friends. You have given me my job. You've given me my career. I was so privileged. I had an opportunity to study abroad in Rome when I went to the University of Dallas. My faith was such a place of purpose in my life. Things were challenging with me and my family as I was growing up in my adolescence, and so the church became my family. It was everything that I knew. And so at this moment of me deciding to come out when I was in treatment, I was like, I could lose everything. But also in these grief letters, you confront, whether it's someone in your life that's harmed you or Catholicism or just someone you lost to death or whatever. You say all the nice things, but then and the good things, but then you say all the things that you've lost, like in losing you,
Mm.
or because of my conversion therapy, like all of the pain I've went through, all the trauma, all of the double life that I led, this fear of eternal condemnation. So at that point, I finally sort of came out and then pretty quickly like met other people like you, and I began to realize, oh wow, I'm not the only one. This was conversion therapy, and I started to talk about it. And in March of 2020, right before the pandemic hit, I went on my first podcast to talk about it. And I was still employed at a Catholic church. And pretty quickly, within months, the bishop, like an old priest friend of mine, heard it. The bishop found out. The bishop called my boss into his office, not me, and basically said, like, we need to terminate Christopher's employment. It was the pandemic. We were all sheltering in place,
Mm.
and I was looking at my employment being terminated, and I had to
Mm.
find a job in 2 months. The priest basically convinced the bishop, like, if you can just let him stick around and find a new job, like that will be a lot better than the scandal of sort of terminating his employment. So I basically had two
Yeah.
months, and thank goodness I found a job barely. But essentially, I lost my job due to LGBTQ, discrimination, and due to me speaking out against conversion therapy. And it,
Hmm.
and I don't know, you mentioned at the beginning, like the harms that we faced, and sometimes I understate them, or I'm like, no, I didn't really lose my job because I was gay. Like I didn't really face employment discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
And I did. And it's legal for churches because of First Amendment speech protections. And the conversion therapy that I went through is legal because of First Amendment speech protections. And we're so used to trying to minimize it. So all of that to say is I think it might have been that podcast that I went on. Like that's where it all started. That's where I met
Yeah.
you. I think it's definitely where I met Simon. And
Yeah.
then I don't know, 5 years later, 8 years later, I mean, 2020, yeah, 5 years later, like these lifelong friendships that we've gotten, and then to be on the other side, right, is just incredible to see how far we've come. And then along the way, every few months, we meet someone who is at that early part of that journey who does not yet see a light at the end of the tunnel. And what a
Hmm.
privilege and blessing it is to sort of
Hmm.
like walk with them, which is why
Hmm.
we're, in a lot of ways having this conversation today.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, okay, a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
I do want to return to the termination thing. I don't think that's something that we've really talked much about. And so thinking about that podcast that led to the bishop saying we need to terminate Chris's employment. In that podcast, my understanding is that you didn't say anything in contradiction to church teaching. You didn't say you were going to live your life in any particular way that was in opposition to church teaching. Basically, all that you were doing was saying that this particular practice is harmful. And I think there's something a little bit ironic there because a lot of Catholics will say, well, the Catholic Church doesn't officially teach that conversion therapy is what you should do. It doesn't endorse conversion therapy. But when you make silence around the harms of conversion therapy a condition of employment, when a bishop does that, they're actually teaching something about what the church has to say. So I would say, at least in that diocese, what the church is teaching is that you need to support conversion therapy. You can't speak out about the harms of it. And we're not going to have you participate fully in this community if you're not going to abide by that.
Mm-hmm.
Which, to me, I mean, Catholics give a lot of mixed messages. And when I hear stories like this, I'm like, you don't get to say that because this is the reality. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was about my conversion therapy. At that point, I had sort of decided to come out, and I think I talked about falling in love for the first time. So I think for them, they really interpreted it as like Christopher is going to live the gay lifestyle, and now he's publicly speaking about it. So it's like it would have been okay had it been hush hush. It's like the choir director. And, hypothetical, I mean, these stories are in the sort of LGBTQ Catholic news. Choir director has been partnered for 25 years to their partner, but they never talked about it. They never did anything. And then they went and had a quiet civil marriage.
Yeah.
And, Karen at the pastoral council wrote a letter to the bishop, and now they're terminated, and now he loses his career, even though they always sort of knew. And so that's not the same situation as me, but I think it's the speaking out and the speaking up. We just need to keep it quiet, right? And so, and I don't fault the people who decades before me did not have the privileges that you and I have now in 2025 to come out to find affirming pockets of the Catholic Church, the Christian Church, friendships, travel that just had to sort of stay in that closet and to this day, like, would have so much to lose, right? Some of them are single, some of them are married, a lot of them are clergy. And so yes, it was nice that I was able to sort of come out and immediately start publicly coming out, or within a couple months. But like other people just don't have that option in the church, and it's better that they stay in. And I'm proof to that, because as soon as I started speaking up, right, like everything quickly changed. I will say this. Those are my greatest fears in that grief letter that I wrote, that like I would lose everything. And I began to lose those things. But one thing that I said in the early podcast is like, what is it to gain the whole world and lose your soul? So is the irony of the scripture verse that like, I was afraid I would lose the whole world of Catholicism. But at that point I was like, I'm dying. Like my soul is dying inside of me. Like you hear about LGBTQ suicides. Like we've lost Alana, who I know we would be friends with today. If she were still here, it's heartbreaking. And so it was that sort of courage that scripture verse rang true of like, I'm going to have to lose the whole world, and obviously just as you would with Christian discipleship, you might lose a lot, but you gain so much more.
But it's hard to see that in the moment, when you're taking the risk, when you're like taking the step over the ledge. I do want to come back to Because, you know, another message that I heard a lot, I think you heard a lot, was from a lot of Catholics that are committed to Catholic Orthodoxy is, you know, the importance of speaking the hard truths, right? And you need to be able to like say the hard things, even if it doesn't sound nice. And usually that's used as a way to kind of like beat down like LGBTQ people. When we talk about our experiences, it's like, well, I'm going to speak the truth, but it's churching, blah, blah, blah. But then on the flip side, when you share the hard truths about the reality of your experience and your history, actually the church doesn't want that, right? So it's, you know, the church wants the truth, but only within a container and only certain kinds of truths. And when I think about you sharing that story, you know, in the podcast, you're talking about the harms of conversion therapy. You're talking about this historical event where you fell in love. That doesn't necessarily say anything about what you're going to do now, other than you're not going to do conversion therapy, right? You know, there are lots of gay Catholics who have their experience that they fall in love with someone, but they do want to commit to church teaching, and so they're trying to figure out like what that means, and they need spaces to process and contextualize all of that. But a lot of times when I've seen like the church respond to those stories and then immediately assume that they're going to reject church teaching, they're going to live the homosexual lifestyle, and then the church kind of cuts them out because of those assumptions, I think a lot of times actually the church is shoving them into the things that they don't want or that they say they don't want. And a lot of times now when I see Catholics have those experiences and the church responds in that way, I tell them, take the gift. Like, the church is pushing you into something that actually they say they don't want, but they're driving you into it. Maybe it'll make you happy. Like, you know, maybe take the pathway they're putting in front of you and see where it goes. And I mean, obviously I also support a lot of people that like want to live by church teaching and find ways to do that. But I just think that often like the church does things and drives people into things they say they don't want. And they do it very
Yeah,
consistently.
right. Like that sort of double standard that like don't make your entire sexuality who you are. It's only one part
Yeah,
of you,
that too.
right? And you come out as whatever your orientation or gender identity is that's outside of church teaching, and then you are then judged by church folks, you know, by that whole thing, right? Like you can be straight and divorced and remarried and cohabitating and living these other sins against chastity and walk into a church. And there might be some grief of like, oh, they're living outside of church teaching and oh, they took communion, that's bad. But like if my husband and I were to walk into church holding hands, like that would be, you know, a huge thing. And so I think that a lot of that is homophobia. Homophobia is like some of the homophobia is sort of the traditional sort of hate, right? But the word
Mm,
homophobia is literally fear of, right? So a
mm,
fear of homosexuality, not hate of. And I experienced a lot when we say church, like I think about these church officials that I met with, and they weren't hateful toward me. A lot of them were grieved, but a lot of them were just afraid of what it
yeah,
meant. I could think of
yeah,
one specifically. This is actually, uh, Chris, where we came to Minneapolis, and you helped us with this. Um, but I distinctly remember talking with church officials about someone, a victim or victim, you know, a conversion therapy survivor in their diocese, and then we began to
yeah.
talk about seminaries and how seminaries could be unhelpful places, and I just remember like these church officials like really, I don't know, experiencing like fear of the what if. Like, what if these things
Mm,
are true, or we have to face these things? A lot of it is intertwined with the church sex abuse crisis,
yeah,
um, and a
yeah,
lot of the what keeps you hidden is fear. It's not always like hate for the victims or hate for, you know, these good things or whatever. It's afraid. It's a lack of courage, and a lack
yeah.
of fortitude to come out and the consequences. And sometimes those consequences are very financial, right? Like it's a protection of the institution. Like if we let this person do this or embrace this thing, or you know they're speaking out this truth of ways that people are being harmed, and you just experience a lot of fear. And then I'll say on an intimate level with like friends and family, I've talked about this before, they experience that grief and that fear. Even,
Yeah.
you know, family members of mine, they weren't necessarily even anti-gay, they were just afraid that I wouldn't be
Mm,
happy, or they were
yeah.
afraid of what it meant for me in the future, because there were no good examples. And even in the church
Yeah.
today, you live in such a bubble, you can't ever think like there are LGBTQ people living out their faith against church teaching, and even embracing that, okay, they're living against church teaching, but there are all these fruits in their lives. Like I still
Mm,
have some friends that are vibrantly living out Catholic church teaching, believe it to be true in their hearts. They're thriving in their lives, and they look at my life and they may have some grief because they're like, Christopher is not experiencing grace in these areas, and I'm sad for him. But they don't ignore all the others, and that doesn't like supersede it. And those are some of the few friendships I've been able to keep holding.
mm,
And they're genuinely curious, you know, like tell me about your marriage and tell me about your hardships, and it's kind of weird because it's to the point where it's like are you affirming? Like, it sounds like you almost want to be. Like, you just want to love the sinner so much. Maybe you really don't hate the sin.
Mm.
But but also like I don't dig to sort of test their theology, because they're still faithful Catholics living out the sacraments and the teaching of the church and often working in the church. And so some of those conversations have been delightful and healing, to be in disagreement, but in a way that's filled with true charity, not like I have to speak the hard truth to him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. I think for me, growing up and maturing and stepping out of these like highly controlled spaces within Catholicism, I think I've been able to appreciate much more of the complexity. You know, I think it's normal to have friends who disagree with various aspects of your life, not just over religious questions, but I mean, even like politically, socially, like how you like manage your finances. You know, you and I have a lot of disagreements. We show up very differently. We have very different approaches to even these questions. And I think it's normal to have that and to be able to engage with people where you have deep fundamental disagreements about the ordering of their lives while still appreciating all of the good things that come out of the unique ways that they live their lives. I think that's just being human. Yeah, but let's get
yeah,
back to, go ahead,
yeah.
Chris.
I guess the way that we were raised to approach sexuality, though, it's like you would think disagreements were okay, but this is the one, personal sexual sin that could cause eternal damnation, and we cut it
Yeah.
so black and white. I mean, that's the irony, that
Yeah.
in Scripture, what Jesus is black and white about, and what he's very extreme about, is like the poor, the marginalized. What you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. Like casting you out, because there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth, right? Like the not helping out the least of these, like that is over and over again where Jesus draws a hard line and tries to strike fear into the disciples about what the gospel is truly about.
Yeah.
And I get that he talks about sexuality and divorce, and if your eye causes you to sin, cut it off, but not 100 times in the gospels. And it's so interesting how Catholics could have so much nuance when it comes to helping the marginalized, like, oh,
Mm.
that homeless person on the side of the road, like, well, I can't really give them food because I don't know what they're going to do, or, how much you're really giving to charity, or, things like just war theory, like when Catholics talk about just war, and the popes are just preaching so hard against war, and they're always talking about the devastation of the wars that we are like heavily investing in, and we're like, oh, they're just being
Yeah.
political,
Yeah.
So with the
Yeah.
homosexuality issue, it's like no nuance is available. There's this hard line. They're so scared of our eternal damnation. There's like no mercy and compassion and nuance in this issue. There's so much fear. But then somehow we find this whole reservoir of like nuance and compassion and God's mercy with all of these other social issues that Jesus
Yeah.
talks about very intensely that are not
Yeah.
convicting Catholics today. And so those begin to convict me along the way.
Yeah.
But I think that's my theory of why what you're saying is like, why can't we just disagree and still be in community on these things? Because we're taught to really draw hard lines with personal sexual sin and abortion, which I would say is adjacent to that, like abortion and gay marriage, which conveniently is the very politicized culture war issues that have carried us through the last 50 years in American Catholicism. And so I think that's a lot of the reasons why, and the evangelical church, like those two issues have powered the sort of Catholic conservatives and evangelical conservatives. And so I think a lot of that is just how politics have come into our lives so much we don't even realize.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I think about, you mentioned hell and people being really preoccupied with Catholics who have sex outside of marriage or who like masturbate, which is like the same category of sin as like sex outside of marriage. This like preoccupation with a concern about those people going to hell. But then, yeah, when you look at the Gospels and the areas of the Gospels where Catholics would say Jesus is talking about hell, he's usually talking about the wealthy. And it's actually really interesting. Yeah. Kind of on this side of it, of course, we're talking about all this stuff because I went to confession very recently, and it was the first time in a long time, and it was funny because I found myself like actually focusing on things that were very different from what I would have focused on in my adolescence. I like insecurities about like my job and how much money I make and what I do with the money that I have, and supporting others, making more space to support other marginalized communities that are suffering right now. Yeah, just the priorities are so different. But let's kind of go back to, you and I have had some other recorded conversations where we talk about kind of your experience with conversion therapy. I just kind of want to revisit that and maybe unpack some of that again. So could you maybe just, for people who are not familiar with your story, give a high level kind of story,
Yeah.
your story with conversion therapy?
Yeah. Yeah, the first thing is my parents were not the source of it. They got me into Catholicism when I was young as a kid. I grew up Catholic school. And then I had my big conversion in eighth grade, kind of on my own accord. Things were rough in high. I have a great relationship with my family now, and we're so close. But in high school, things were rough, and the church was my haven. So I decided to do a year of mission work because I was just in love with the church. I loved the community that it brought. I was so zealous for the faith. So between high school and college, I did net. So I was a missionary for a year. It was like, this is the most Catholic, discipleship oriented thing I can do. And it was like,
Oh, I looked at Nat. Yeah.
go be it. Like travel the world in a van, travel 90,000 miles, 60,000 miles a year in a van. So at that time, I'd come out to very few people, except maybe my best friend and a note. I remember like my other best, I have a lot of friends named Chris, but like, dear Chris, I'm gay. And I put it in my nightstand. I never gave it to Chris. And I think my mom found it one time. And I was like, nope,
Oh,
nope, not gay. I'm not actually gay. I was just, blah, blah, blah. And I like bold-faced lied to my mom and
hmm.
like closeted, like bolted the door of the
Yeah.
closet, which is crazy that it took 10 more years. But I went to a priest in confession right at the beginning of my service here with Net. And I was confessing my lust and my same-sex attraction. I was around all these religious, holy, zealous dudes, right? And I was just an emotional wreck. I'd never been like so close in this mission year around all these guys, and I was overwhelmed. And I remember the priest right after I confessed my same-sex attraction sin, right? How is your relationship with your father? And that was the seed that was planted from a priest in confession, and then boom. And from there, it was reading things in Net. And actually, I've heard a lot thanks to like organizations like Invitation, like Net. I think it's changed a lot in the ways that it approaches this issue. But when I was there in 2007, it was very much the conversion therapy ethos. This is because of a distant father, overbearing mother. It was pathologized, right? It was the conversion therapy mentality. So by the end of my first year there, like I was completely convinced because I had had a rough sort of childhood and adolescence, like that theory really like hook, line, and sinker, right? Like because I was exposed to pornography early and I felt it was compulsive in my life and masturbation. So by the time I got to University of Dallas, started going to therapy. And I remember shopping therapists. And I went to one therapist that was like the one online, the closest that my insurance took. And I went to them for a meeting or two. And they were progressive, gay affirming. And they were like, maybe you should consider coming out and dating guys. And I was like, nope, 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 nope. You're fired. Right. And so I fired that liberal therapist. And we know there's one good therapist in every city. There's only one good Catholic therapy group. Right. So I'd ask her to find that one. Of course, they didn't take insurance like my other one did, because we don't want to take big, bad liberal insurance. We don't want to listen to the big, bad liberal APA, right? Like the secular scientific. They all just want to take down the church. Right. So I find that niche therapist. I have to pay out of pocket. I think it was like 120 a session. And in 2008, that'd be like $200 a session, now $250 a session, paid out of pocket against the wishes of my parents, right? Like they were like, why are you paying this much? They weren't mental health forward. And then the cost that I was paying as I was working as a student worker. And that therapist who belonged to Opus Dei, like gave me what I wanted to hear. Right. And so that was basically the next 10 years of therapy was shopping therapists that would give me, I would say, reputable modes of therapy. Like things like EMDR and internal family system and parts work. And I mean, therapists listening to this, right? Like talk therapy, obviously, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It was doing all those things with real trauma with the intent that my sexuality would change. And so that's like the actual in the therapist's office stuff that I did between 18 and 28. And I went to therapy pretty much every week consistently. And then on top of that was all of the healing retreats, charismatic healing retreats that was intertwined with like charismatic healing tradition, like since the charismatic renewal of Catholicism in the 60s and 70s. So like Neil Lozano and Unbound and things like Theophostic healing prayer, where you're going back into your memories and you're inviting Jesus into these traumatic memories. And so it was like prayer session after prayer session where I go into the bad memory and the trauma. I am laced in all this extra shame of how bad and icky this sin is because it's gay. And I'm just like wallowing in it. Right? Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, sometimes for a day or a week, depending on the length of retreat. And then you're desperately inviting Jesus and the saints and other people into this to heal the memory. And time after time, I reach some healing with God and I feel so much better and I have so much hope. And then 3 days later, I masturbate thinking about a guy and I'm just devastated, right?
Yeah.
Like this is never going to change. And then it's, well, maybe I didn't want healing enough. Like the man, the pool at the Bethesda, he can't get to the pool soon enough, right? And everybody gets there first. And Jesus comes to the man at Bethesda and he says, do you really want to be healed? right? Like
Mm.
that verse, it just the trauma that I carried all those years doing everything that I could, spending all the money and time and resources that I could on fixing this, having to go back time and time again in prayer and say, I guess I really just don't want conversion. I just want the sin that bad,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
after doing
Yeah.
all of that effort. So 10
Mm.
years later, I spent $50,000 over that course of my life, taking out medical loans, spending money that I inherited from a relative's passing, working in the church, right? Like all of that. And I remember when I finally came out, I was actually at one of the healing retreats, and the healing of the pool of Bethesda scripture came up. And it was just remarkable, the healing, thinking of the pool at Bethesda of, um, I like put myself into that prayer and sort
Yeah.
of just like moment with Jesus, him being like, sort of like you're already healed, or there was no
Mm.
wound or whatever, like me rushing
Yeah.
down all of the time. And it's hard to explain, but it was just this very healing moment. And I had to sit quietly because I was with all of my super Catholic friends at this healing retreat that I had recruited all of them to, right? Like I invited all of them to heal. So they're all
Yeah.
sitting here and I'm just like, what do I do? Like in this
Yeah.
healing moment. And then people are like, did you have any, like, what was your healing? Or like, what happened to you? And I was like, I don't want to really want to talk about it, right?
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine if I would have spoken up or spoken out, like
Hmm.
what that would have caused.
Yeah.
So that was a very like roundabout answer to the conversion therapy and healing ministry
Mm.
stuff.
Yeah, you sharing that story, I think that's common for a lot of people who spend a lot of time in conversion therapy, whether with a prayer healer or with some kind of like therapist or pastoral counselor. The increasing sense of self-blame and the increasing sense that there's something wrong with you, the more and more you go into it, combined with the increased effort as you go, right? Like, how can that not tear down a person emotionally, psychologically, spiritually? And it really helps to explain why there are such high rates of like anxiety, depression, risk for suicide, symptoms of PTSD for people who've gone through conversion therapy. And when I think about your situation, um, it makes me kind of mad, to be honest. I had a friend who shared a story about his pastor giving really like non-affirming messages to him, pushing him to hide his like desires and his sexual orientation, and he did that all through his 20s, and he like kind of got into his 30s, and he felt all this anger around like, I feel like I wasted my like youth and beauty and my best years on these lies, and I'll never get that back. And I think for you, there's definitely that, like wasted this like huge period of my life and also sunk a lot of money into it. Like when you're that young, tens of thousands of dollars is a lot of money. And especially when you're working for the church and you
Yeah.
already don't make any
If you
money.
got a loan, I mean, yeah, like if you got a
Yeah.
medical loan, I mean, thankfully interest rates were low back at that time.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. When I think about, conversion therapy, I think about like, and the ways that it harms people, I think about this because I suspect that there are many, many more stories just like yours where people are either still stuck in it or they're ashamed and scared and don't want to talk about it, or they just move on and they're like, I actually can't talk about this anymore. And a lot of them just leave the church.
Yep. And how could someone spend this much? People that are on the outside that don't get it, right? Like how can you
Yeah.
spend this much time? How do you believe it that well? Even like
Yeah.
sort of liberal Catholics that were gay affirming when I was working at a progressive church, and I would like talk about this, they just didn't get it. They were like, because they had been marching like in honor of Stonewall since the 70s as a liberal Catholic. Like even they don't understand like the power of the words of someone like Christopher West. I go by the name Christopher because of Christopher West,
Hmm.
actually,
No,
because I was in
I
the
didn't know
Theological
that.
Institute and I so admired him. And it was him that I heard the word Christopher means Christ bearer. And so
Hmm.
I changed from Chris to Christopher.
Hmm.
Like that is how personally impactful this movement was for me.
Yeah.
And for people who don't know, Christopher West is a very, very, very influential sort of pop culture oriented person around Catholic conservative sexual ethics. But to sort of go outside of that, I said this to Kay the other day, and it's something that I had probably heard or read, just put very succinctly. So it wasn't something I came up with at all, but it was just like anywhere and everywhere there is conversion therapy, it is because of people that are passionate and religious, and
Hmm.
because eternal damnation or eternal life is at stake, right? Like there find me anywhere in America, at least in 2025, where people are pursuing conversion therapy, where it is not for religious reasons, because at the end of the day, like it becomes a religious theological issue. And what's hard is like a lot of the places it's being fought, right? Like in the courts and stuff, like it's this very secular thing. You try to make these secular arguments and you make it all about psychology and a lot of the reparative therapy and the PhD psychologists that are showing up, right? But the bishops going to the Supreme Court and advocating like for conversion therapy bans to be removed. Like at the end of the day, like this is a theological issue, and they truly believe in their heart of hearts that sort of homophobia, that fear of that we're all going to be eternally damned. And I just like that is the answer to the question all the time of how could you do this for so many years, or why are people so passionate about protecting this? And you know the arguments sometimes are like First Amendment speech, da da da. And it's like no, you think we're going to hell forever, eternal conscious torment. Like that is what brought me to confession over and over and over again after masturbating or looking at porn, right? That is why when I'm gay married, like that is the unforgivable sin. Like it's one thing if I hook up and apologize, or you know, look at porn or masturbate and apologize. But if I get into a lifelong partnership with another man, even if I want to dedicate my life to him and adopt children, like that is the unforgivable sin that you have chosen, right? And that is the devastation of like, oh, Christopher got married, like he's going to go to hell, you know? And so that's where, to me, that it has to be talked about, that has to be brought up, that like this is about heaven or hell.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the other reason why people also get stuck in this is because the narrative is so powerful and it's self-perpetuating, right? So you have this narrative where you keep going. You're also seeing some of the most reputable Catholics in this area when you're doing this. You know, we haven't really brought up like Dr. Bob Schuchts yet, but you know, he's part of this narrative as well. He's presented by a lot of Catholic speakers, bishops, leaders as one of the most important voices in helping people find healing in the church. So you're seeing him and he's cloaked in all the authority that's given to him across the church. And there's the narrative that, you know, the reason why is because you need to keep digging deeper. There's more to go, right? And obviously if you keep digging, you're always going to find more areas of woundedness you can work on. So there's also the confirmation bias there. But then even when you come out of this, I just thought it was so interesting how when you spoke with America Magazine about your experiences in conversion therapy and the harms that you experienced working, some of it with Dr. Bob Schuchts, and then his response in the article is to respond back to you by publicly gaslighting you, by saying, oh, well, people who push back against this stuff have just not really addressed their wounds, right? So even after spending a decade and tens of thousands of dollars and increasing self-hatred over time, and then checking yourself into inpatient therapy and just realizing this isn't working, you leave, and then your former counselor has the audacity to publicly gaslight you in a paper, which, by the way, would not be acceptable for a licensed therapist. For a licensed therapist to do that in that way in the paper would be unethical, and you'd be able to file an ethics complaint against them. But because a lot of these people don't operate under their licenses, there's no governing body to hold them accountable when they engage in unethical behavior. But, you know, that's some stuff I think about how you get stuck in that for so long. They continue to gaslight you even when you're gone.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that like do I want to sort of like tell the whole story, because it's the whole story of how that sort of happened, or how it's all happened since then upon coming out. Like I would, you know, a lot of it is them experiencing grief. Like that's why I always bring up this like this idea of grief, of they sort of I fell away, right? Like you hear in the rumor mill and in that circle of Theological the Body Institute and the JP2 Healing Center with Dr. Bob and Christopher West, like, oh, me, Christopher, he's come out. Did you hear he's gay married? Like just a lot of sadness and grief. But I'm sort of radio silent because nobody really reached out to me. They didn't want to debate me. And so I didn't really talk with anybody. So you kind of lose touch with all these people that were the most important people of your life. And then I start going on the podcast, and I go on yours and I start talking about it. And then I go on America Magazine. And I will say that the sort of nuance of that is I go on America Magazine, and Eve Tushnet interviewed me, and she was very, very gracious. But the way that the editors edited it and the way that I saw it read, like I actually was upset at the way that it just very briefly talked about the greatest trauma in my life. And I remember being upset for other reasons. So that's one thing. And number two, I remember one of the responses he had. I actually ended up talking with Dr. Bob after this. He read this article and he's all of a sudden hearing all these people because it's over the phone, right? Like he hadn't seen the article yet. He had just gotten a call from an editor, because basically the way it works in journalism is if I'm going to talk about somebody specifically, like they should have an opportunity to respond, which is why you always read an article about something and it said, we called them and they didn't respond for comment. We called them and they didn't respond for comment, right? So they called him so that he could have a chance to comment. And it was like, hey, these are the allegations against you. What do you have to say for yourself? And his response, one of them was, it's really sad when these things are politicized, which is a very was very damaging. And to your point, like, did it feel like gaslighting, and how can you say something that trite? Well, maybe a year or two later, I think it was maybe after I talked with you, him and I reconnected over the phone, and we had like a 2-hour conversation about all of this and how it happened for him, and how he was really surprised and taken by surprise, and then how he was quoted, and he was frustrated with how he was quoted, and I was frustrated as I was quoted. And he's like, what if we had a conversation, And so I think we talked another time or two alone, and then he said, what if we have a recorded conversation about this? And I was kind of like honored that he would bring me on his podcast. So him and his partner named Jake, his like therapy partner, and they ran this podcast. They ended up having me on as a sort of like person on the other side of the issue, because we had a relationship to like, let's debate this issue in charity. And I was on a 5-part series about same-sex attraction. I was like the 5th guest maybe, or the 4th guest. And all the ones before me were reinforcing Catholic Church teaching, talk about the sort of that pathologized approach, like my sexuality has been healed, or I've been healed in these ways, like very pro, right? Everything that I had believed and that they believed. And I was there to say against. And we had a surprisingly charitable conversation, because when you're actually in the room together, like now other people are like, why in the heck would you ever go to your conversion therapist, right? That you had all of this harm for. And this is, not everybody would believe this, but like, I mean, we did have a friendship and a relationship, and I admired him, and a lot of
I find that part of it troubling as well.
Yeah.
Him serving as your
Before
counselor, therapist.
Hold on.
Okay, we'll come back.
I will say that this is one of the issues that you and I actually disagree on. And so if we're going to go into this, what ends up happening is you have your experience of like being like this, and then I have my experience of actually being with Bob. So it's hard for me, because what ends up happening is these are people in my life for 10 years, and hearing the words that are coming out of your mouth, it's like, I feel like I have to actually defend and counter you and defend them, because I'm responsible for those 10 years of my life and those relationships that I held. And if I just go full in with you, like, that's going to burn more bridges with them. And again, but this is true to me. I'm not just trying to like sugarcoat it. It's just, I think there's I guess there's real nuance there. I mean, I'm curious if you had that Dr. Bob person in your life, or those people in your life that harmed you. I thought there was one person that you had that was like, this person harmed me, and I actually saw them in an event. It was like a...
No, well, yeah, I mean...
a little bit different.
Yeah, I do... I did have an experience of... I had experienced sexual assault by a Catholic who then was speaking at an event that I attended as a Catholic. And there's a lot of ironies of me feeling like I was sidelined by the organization in a lot of ways, and they were in this place of prominence. But I think I wanted to go actually in a different direction, which is just kind of the, what frustrates me in a lot of these relationships with conversion therapists is because a lot of times the lines are blurred between therapist, counselor, employee, friend.
Yeah.
In this world, the lines they're very murky. And they're murky in a way that would be unethical for a licensed therapist. Having these mix of relationships and power dynamics when you're engaging in a therapeutic relationship is really troubling, which is why it's usually not permitted in the context of licensed therapy. And one of my concerns actually, and this, I will say my sensitivity around this also comes from being a lawyer, and also as someone who studied the clergy abuse crisis and watched the ways in which professional lines were not followed and given enough attention helped contribute to the clergy abuse crisis. That's part of where I have this strong reaction when people say that my conversion therapist also had these other relationships, which also makes talking about it later on more complicated because it's hard to focus on the problematic aspects of the therapeutic relationship because you're also having to respond to this broader relationship that you have with them.
Yeah. So as I finished sort of this storyline, all of what you're saying kind of comes in. So I'm on this podcast with the 3 of them, and we're having a charitable conversation, and we talk a lot about grief, and we talk a little bit about my history with them, and it's very again, it's there's just a lot of charity in the room, even though we're very much disagreeing. After my episode, apparently it was so charitable and there was so
Hmm.
much bridge building that went on that
Hmm.
a lot of people and a lot of listeners were very upset because they basically said, as I understand it, after a conversation with Bob, is they didn't condemn the sin enough, or like they
Oh,
didn't
yeah.
speak the truth enough, right?
Yeah.
Because when the episode ended, it was kind of this place of sadness, but they didn't like circle the wagons and do all that stuff, and so it was left open, even though they had 3 or 4 episodes before me. So
Yeah.
after that, there was a follow-up episode that I was unaware of, where basically they had to recircle the wagons and like tie up all the loose ends where there might have been these questions, like because of listener response. And
Yeah.
it's phobia. It's like I said, it's the phobia of, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
souls are at stake. Like there wasn't enough truth spoken here in love. And so they had an episode without me. And that is the one that I
Where
haven't
they just
spoken
talked about you. Yeah.
where they talked about me without me in the room, out of a place of grief, saying, we're so sad for Christopher. He's chosen to live this life. And then they basically said, like, a lot of people that are living in this sin, it's because there's a compulsion that they haven't healed from.
Yep.
And Dr. Bob actually did this thing where you could listen to the episode unless he takes it down. He actually spoke to me out in the airwaves and he said, Christopher, you never reached the point of chastity. And I am like, oh my God,
That is
how did my
so
marriage with my
toxic.
husband, how did my marriage with my husband and my happy life that I'm living, which didn't really come up in conversation, like you're now circling back and basically saying I never reached the point of chastity to everybody, to the public, basically. And then they started talking about like the compulsions of pornography and masturbation. How does he know 8 years later, or 6 years later, if I'm still
Yeah.
addicted to porn and compulsively masturbate
Yeah.
just because I'm in a marriage with my husband? It was that assumption.
And also, it's so inappropriate
I know,
for
I know.
him to bring that out from
We'll
your
get there.
past
Yeah, yeah.
therapeutic relationship.
So I was like, oh my gosh, did he just do that? Right? Like, and he stumbled
Yeah.
into it on accident because he was trying to use me as like a figure for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And I was like, how would you know if I'm chaste or not? But just again, the assumption that like I'm living with another man and homosexuality is all about the sin, right? And all about like the physical thing. Like that's really the problem, is those physical sexual things. So therefore I'm still addicted to porn and masturbation. And I was like, I literally told you those things in your therapy office, because when I first started going to the JP2 Healing Center, Bob was still licensed in the state of Florida. And a lot of the prayer healing ministry meetings that I went to were in his office in Tallahassee, Florida. Was it therapy or was it the JP2 Healing Center? And I paid money and I went back and I wish I could find receipts. So basically I was like, not only did you accidentally just spill my tea, or what you thought was my tea, to everybody and sort of sort of accusatory in that way, but I told you those things in the confidence of your office when you were a licensed therapist in Florida. But by then he had stopped practicing his license. By then he had let his therapy license expire in Florida, and he was just full-time doing prayer healing ministry. And so that is the perfect example of what you're saying, of trying to have it both, that like Dr. Bob Schuchts is admired because he has 30 years of licensed marriage family therapy.
Yep.
So people look
And that's something.
as a therapist, but he is not practicing his license right now, because if he was, he would be liable to a lot of the issues like that. And I mean, conversion therapy in Florida, Lord, it's probably not outlawed, and I'm not a minor. I mean, we get into that. But I think, to your point, like that's the difficulty, is if you want to do prayer healing ministry and you really want to be free to do that, you do that in speaking, you do that in individual prayer healing, and sort of a life coaching thing.
Yeah.
You don't want to do it in your office because
Yeah.
of the legal limitations from the big, bad liberal government, right? Like that is trying to legislate away like the work of God, and that just doesn't understand what true healing is. Right. And so, yeah, that's that.
But for me, it's not even the conversion therapy piece of it. Let's say he's not practicing conversion therapy. The way that he's handling the therapeutic relationship is unethical based off of the requirements that you have when you're operating as a licensed therapist. For him to like come out and bring that stuff later, for him to have these mixed relationships with his clients, this is unethical behavior when you're a licensed therapist. But because he's not acting under a license, he's not accountable for that.
Yep.
People don't understand when you go and see a pastoral counselor counselor that's not licensed, and they're not contractually obligated to maintain things like confidentiality, if they go and talk on a podcast about your experiences with them and disclose personal information, you don't have anyone to report that to. They can do that. And churches that encourage these types of relationship are opening up people to all kinds of abuse. We saw this with ex-gay ministries, where people went in, the counselors sexually abused their clients, and you know who they could report them to? No one. Yep. The only recourse they could do is the victims had to spend time and money and resources and hire a lawyer and file lawsuits where their stuff would be aired publicly, because these become parts of court documents.
Yeah, I mean, so, the fact that it was something I confidentially shared in the bounds of therapy when he was licensed back then, like, I don't know. I was really, really hurt after that episode, and I know that he didn't mean to do it in that negative way. A lot of it was he's like, how do I respond to my listeners who are so upset by this that don't think we're condemning the sin enough, right? And so it was a statement he made, right? Like, that he probably had no idea, like, was, so hurtful to me and potentially illegal. And it sucks that, like, now here I am again talking about them without them in the room, saying my side of the story. But I have not gone publicly and talked about this. But the last conversation that was had publicly about me was them talking about me in the room when I was not there. Yeah. If you go to that podcast website right now and you go to Restore the Glory podcast and you go to the About section, it says, Dr. Bob Schuchts and Jake Khym are Catholic therapists with over 50 years combined experience teaching and accompanying people into fuller life and freedom. He has not updated his own bio on his podcast website that I was on, saying that he is a former therapist. So there are biographies of him on his podcast website and everywhere where it still says he is a therapist, and other places where he has updated it because his license has expired. So there it is right there advertised. He is a Catholic therapist with combined 50 years experience.
Oh, I mean, he's done that. He puts that in his bios and books. He's been doing that since he hasn't been a therapist. And Catholic organizations that are putting him forward that don't recognize that he's misrepresenting himself have no business telling us how to live our lives. Mm-hmm. But we're coming up against time. And I actually also just want to touch on one really, I think, important part of this. Obviously this gets me really worked up, and part of it is, seeing all the people who've been hurt. Part of it is because of, like, being a licensed professional myself and being attentive to these kinds of issues in my own work. One of the things that I think is also really confusing, and it can be hard to step out of these spaces, is because I really do think Dr. Bob and all these people are really well-intentioned. I do really think that, they are caring people. They tend to be really kind people. They tend to be, like, the kind of person where, you just, like, want to sit down and maybe have, like, a dinner conversation with them. And so, I mean, I do want to give space for that. You did say that, part of this is, we're having our conversation and not everyone involved is in the room. And so I do also want to recognize that, like, there are lots of stories, there are lots of valid ways of telling this, and we're just sharing one version of the story that I think you and I are both trying to share as accurately and as, like, charitably as possible, while also being direct. Can you just talk a little bit about kind of, like, I don't know, like, what you empathize with for them?
I mean, I know it's like, beating a dead horse, but I think I could think of, like, how they're listening, right? Of just this grief of, like, this is sort of considered, I know this is, I don't want to spin this in a whole hard thing, but, like, why can't we sort this out together? How has this relationship become so fractured that we can't dialogue together anymore? And the grief of the loss of friendship. But the beating a dead horse piece is, like, the grief that, like, I am on a path of destruction. I mean, path of destruction. We know that phrase, right? Like, that is what they're very afraid of. That, like, I could tell them that I'm living a life that's full of the fruits of the Spirit, and I'm living in service to others, and still, I mean, literally, like, we're wrapping this up because I'm about to go to church because it's a Sunday morning, right? Like, and that I'm living in a happy marriage with my husband. Like, who knows? We may adopt one day, right? Adopt kids. Like, that our life is so nuanced and it's still so colorful, but the pastoral approach is that very black and white, and it's just so it's so piled upon with grief. And so I think that is is what leads people to these extremes, is the true fear of sort of eternal damnation. And so it is really hard because there's the conversion therapy and the church teaching, and then there's this space where people want to fight conversion therapy but hold to church teaching.
Mm,
And it's hard because I don't want to be dishonest, but like I have to confront both. I think when I say being dishonest, like
sure.
it's hard
I
for
see.
me to ethically say, oh, we could fight conversion therapy and we could fight this toxic approach to sexuality. Um, but like the church is right on this issue of homosexuality.
Hmm.
And I just like I'm like the reason that all of this damage happens is because at the end of the day, this is what the church teaches about this issue. And I guess like added on to that is that the sort of heaven or hell mentality and really raising up homosexuality is worse than all of these other sins.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, I think we're about time and moving on to my next conversation. Thank you for sharing, Christopher. Obviously, I think there's a lot more we could get into, obviously. I think the last time that we did this, I had to release it in 3 episodes. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, our friendship continues. The conversation continues. I really appreciate you sharing. I also, again, want to emphasize that for all the other people that we've talked about, like, especially, I mean, I still identify as Catholic. I think you still identify as Catholic. Like, we are in this church together. This is messy. This is complicated. Ultimately, I hope that we can have better relationships. But I also think having better relationships involves taking accountability. And certainly you and I want to take accountability for harms that we've caused. We just haven't seen sufficient accountability taken on the other side, which would involve, ironically, also change.
yep.
But we'll do our best to just share these stories and be as charitable as we can when we
Yeah,
do.
and I think my closing comments about that is like, where do we go from here, right? You're one of the people that really tries to help confront the systems and lead people to accountability. And I think for me, I love to do outreach because I know there are people in isolation that are out there on the
Yeah,
margins that are like, I've never heard this story told. I was
yeah,
a victim of this. I think my sibling might have been, my cousin might have been, my coworker might have been. And so how remarkable it is over the last several years that because of these conversations, I don't know how many hearts and minds were changing on the other side. Like that could be
sure.
confrontational, combative because everyone's digging their heels. But in the middle ground, sort of in those trenches, are people that are just like alone and isolated. And so I think my encouragement to any sort of listener is to have the courage to reach out. In 2025, it's such a privilege that we have this online community and that people could Facebook message or email. And there is this sort of healthy level of anonymity that people could finally come out of hiding and form these small communities, whether they're lay people or clergy. And to your point of accountability, like I was a part of the system. Like
Hmm.
I was a part of the harm for more of my adult life than I was a part of the solution.
Yeah,
And so I just feel that there's people listening being like, wow, have I been a part of the problem? Do
yeah,
I even want to reach out? Do I even really want to face this that I've
yeah,
sort of helped perpetuate? And
yeah,
so I would say like, yes, there's healing, there's mercy, there's reconciliation, like the same kind of healing and reconciliation, merciful God that I'm asking for and like having a nuanced approach to this, like is also there for people that have been a part of the problem as
yeah,
we say it.
absolutely. Yeah,
If obviously if there's willing to be repentance and reconciliation. So I just want to leave with that sort
yeah,
of invitation to
yeah,
come out of hiding and to experience
yeah,
mercy and
yeah,
acceptance.
yeah, yeah. There's always grace and there's always mercy, but it just doesn't always look like what you'd expect. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thanks for
Cool.
having me. It was great to chat, friend.
Thanks for coming. Yeah, we'll chat later.